The alarm shrieks as the sliding doors part, and the guard's forearm slams across my chest, his badge flashing like a cold sun under the supermarket fluorescents, while my grandson, small and shaken from the school parade, clutches his scuffed backpack as if it were the last honest thing he owns. Around us, the afternoon smells of lemon cleaner and overripe peaches. Carts rattle like chains on tile, and the guard smirk says, policy, the way a boot says ground, his voice drilling through the aisle as if I were a lesson he's eager to teach, while I stand in my Sunday jacket with a blue folder pressed to my ribs, receipts stamped and steady, trying to keep my hands from trembling where every eye can see 'em. I watch him tilt his chin, savoring the moment he thinks he owns, the old man stalled, the boy dimming, and I draw one breath, slow as a fuse, because if this door is a stage and humiliation is the script, then I will turn the scene with proof and procedure before the lights go black. Before I continue, tap subscribe and say where you're listening. If this resonates, share it so doors stay open for people like me. The humiliation arrived before I could set one foot past the sliding doors. The censer chirped like a whistle in a quiet church, and the guard's arm rose across my chest with the same unthinking certainty as a crossing bar at a railroad. The breeze from the air curtain pushed grocery smells over us, ripe peaches, bleach from a freshly mopped aisle, the metallic breath of the refrigerators. My grandson's backpack brushed my hip as I stopped too suddenly. Heads turned. Somewhere above, a fluorescent tube ticked. I held onto the cart so my hands would have something honest to do besides tremble. I had carried a small blue folder all day, out of habit more than plan. It felt like the kind of object that steadies a person in public. Paper squared, corners sharp, proof ready. The stamped receipt I'd gotten at Register 3 was clipped inside, still warm when I first tucked it away, now cooling against the cardboard backer. I kept my voice low and my posture plain. When you're my age, posture speaks first. I wanted to move, to glide into the late afternoon and make a simple supper, but the store had other ideas. The guard said, policy. His badge caught the light and threw it back like a hard glance. The cart's wheels squeaked because the front left one always does. I noticed that even as my chest tightened. The clock above the customer service counter read 4:12. The aisles were a shallow canyon of end-cap displays and cut-out signs promising 2 for 1 if you obeyed the fine print. The speakers exhaled a soft tune no one really hears until they're forced to stand still. My grandson hovered to my right, trying to take up less air than a boy can. His backpack hung as if it had done something wrong. I have learned to read a face the way you read a weather map. The guard's face was a forecast of steady pressure and scattered clouds. He spoke about a random check, about the way alarms work, a kind of innocent science that still lands on the same bodies in the same doorways at the same hours. He gestured to the counter and asked us to step aside for a second. In markets, a second is never a second. Seconds are threads. They knot around you. I guided the cart toward the counter, away from the floor of people. The floor shone with that afternoon gloss that smells like lemon and ammonia. The plastic mat under the counter had a nick in it where 1,000 shoes had snagged. I placed the blue folder on the laminate and felt the relief of a flat surface. The receipt inside made the soft rasp of paper against paper when I opened it part way, just enough to touch the ink stamp with a fingertip, as if a little ceremony could calm my pulse. My grandson took out his phone and held it at his chest like a small shield. He looked at me and I answered without words, steady. The attendant behind the counter wore a name tag I did not need to memorize yet. Her computer screen had a pale login window waiting for credentials. She tapped the code, then another, the way people do when they're sure the second attempt will fix what the first didn't. People drifted by with baskets of grapes and paper towels and after-school snacks. They didn't stare, not exactly. They did that careful looking you learn in a country where looking too long is a claim. I could feel the weight of the day pooling around my ankles. We had left the school parade with drumlines still rattling my ribs and conversations tangled around a holiday that asks more of memory than parades know how to carry. My plan had been simple: buy bread, broth, a few greens, go home, set the table, hold a small class or two at our kitchen, where history can fit in a bowl and a story can take the edge off the world. But simple plans are fragile. They snap at the first hard edge. The guard stayed near, not touching, never touching, just there, a pillar that could move if he had to. He pointed at the backpack, then at the porter we'd tripped. Words like procedure and verification hovered over us like fluorescent hum. I asked for the supervisor, not as a challenge, as a step. Steps keep a man upright. I mentioned the receipt, the register number, the time. The attendant nodded as if those things were pieces she could place later. She poked the keyboard again. The system hesitated, then shook its head behind glass. The air tasted faintly of copper. My mouth had gone dry the way it does when a dentist asks you questions with tools in your gums. I unzipped the front pocket of the blue folder and touched the pen inside to confirm it was still mine. Little checks, calming checks. I don't rush to anger because I know where anger leads. I balance myself on what can be written down. I reminded myself of the order in which I had placed the milk, the bread, the bunch of cilantro that smelled of its own small field. I remembered my grandson turning the cot so a woman with a cane could pass. Small stones in the pocket, proof of the last hour. The guard looked over his shoulder, radio clipped to his shoulder, waiting for the voice that would decide how long this second needed to be. Another employee walked past and left a trail of cold air that smelled like the door to the freezer had been opened somewhere behind the swinging flap. The attendant asked us to stand on a yellow strip of tape to give the next customer room. The tape had words on it about courtesy. I placed the front wheel of the cart on the edge of the strip. My grandson stood beside me with his hands tucked under the straps of his backpack, trying to be smaller, and I felt the old ache of watching a child learn the shape of suspicion. I counted my breaths in the ticks of the clock. The intercom said a manager was needed in produce. Another voice said a spill needed a mop in aisle 9. Every sentence in a store like this is a little law that rearranges bodies. I asked the attendant to make a note that we had requested a supervisor. She nodded and wrote something I could not read from where I stood. The band of the watch on her wrist left a pale line of skin where the sun had not reached. I held the receipt now. I took it out and laid it flat on the counter next to the blue folder. The ink stamp was clean, the time crisp. The paper held the total and the last 4 digits of something that matters in these places. I pointed to register 3, at the far end, where the conveyor belt still carried other people's dinners toward the scanner's red eye. My palm was steady, but it took work. Everything takes work at my age, even standing still. The supervisor did not arrive. The radio said he was on his way, but radios are hopeful by design. The guard shifted one foot, then the other. He was a man in a job, and jobs pull people into shapes they didn't invent. I did not want to make him an enemy because I know what that costs. I wanted the process to take its full breath and name what it was. My grandson looked up at the clock. I could feel the question he wasn't asking. I drew one finger along the edge of the receipt to keep my mind from sliding. The attendant finally opened a form on her screen. The fields were blank and hungry. She asked a question that sounded like a requirement, and then she frowned at the mouse as if it had betrayed her. She clicked again, and the form blinked away. She tried a different screen, a different password, a different kind of patience. I could hear the bakery oven cycling down for the evening, a soft exhale like someone forgiving a mistake. I asked her to note the time and the request for written confirmation, not to make a scene, to leave a trail. We waited. Bodies flowed around us in eddies. The guard kept his station. The counter collected the usual scratches and then one more.
Somewhere a child laughed the way children laugh when they're near the candy shelves and there's still daylight left. I steadied myself with the thought of boiling water and tearing bread later, even if later had moved farther down the road than I had planned. Under the overhead bulbs, the blue of my folder looked like a small square of calm lake water in a busy city. I noticed the door at the edge of the service area, the one employees use when they vanish into the back and return with authority. I listened for footsteps that meant someone with a name tag that could decide. The clock blinked and swallowed another minute. I did not let my mind run ahead to lessons or comforts or conclusions. The day had planted me here like a stake. I would mark this ground with the simplest tools I had: a receipt, a folder, a voice that did not rise. The automatic doors hissed open behind us, and the alarm screamed again. The scream tangled with the sound of the doors, and for a second the world shrank to a funnel of noise. The guard lifted his radio, the same practiced arc as before, eyes measuring the space between us and the threshold as if distance could be guilt. I kept my cart steady. 2 wheels on the yellow strip, 2 on the tile. The current of shoppers split around us like water around a rock. My grandson flinched, then set his feet again, and I felt the way his breath tried to find a slower gear. The attendant's gaze lifted from the flickering form and asked us to hold where we were. Her voice had the politeness of printed signs. She tapped a command, tapped again, and a beige progress bar crept across her screen as if it had knees. The lemon cleaner smell thickened. Behind us, the doors whispered shut, and the alarm inhaled silence. The guard apologized to the air, not to us, then reminded me about policy. Words like policy drifted down over my shoulders like dust and stayed. I unclipped the receipt from the blue folder and placed it flat beneath the counterlight. I read each line softly to myself, not to argue, but to give my hands a script. Register 3, time 4:08, total, tax, change. The stamp, a neat square that made a tidy truth. My grandson edged closer to the counter, holding his phone at chest level. He wasn't filming. He was making a list. Time the alarm sounded. Time we were asked to step aside. Time the form refused to load. He's careful like that, and careful is a kind of courage when carelessness would be easier. The attendant's printer coughed and swallowed its own spit. She frowned, clicked, and the form rebooted back to nothing. The guard suggested we roll the cart through the portal again to clear it. I answered that we would wait for a supervisor before repeating any step. Not defiance, sequence. I asked the attendant to note that request in the record. She said she would. Her pen hovered and skated, and I watched the ink lay down a tiny river of our place in this afternoon. The hum of a refrigeration felt louder because our part of the store had become quiet. People learned to walk around our paws. Shoes squeaked. A hand truck rattled across the seam where tile meets rubber mat. A child asked a question in a small voice, and a parent answered with a yes that sounded like "not now." The clock read 4:17, and each minute after that turned into a thumbnail pressing the same sore spot under my collarbone. My grandson took a long breath and blew it out carefully, like cooling soup.
I asked the attendant for a printed copy of the store's verification policy, the one usually posted near the exit in letters too small to read unless you already know what they say. She glanced at the back hall and said she could try to find it. The guard said the policy was simple and fair. I did not dispute fair. I asked for words on paper. Papers have edges, edges define. While we waited, I arranged the bread and greens in the cart so the bag of apples would not bruise. I put the broth near the front.
a small lighthouse among colored boxes. The supervisor's voice finally crackled on the radio, promising to arrive after he cleared something in produce. Produce is a good reason for delay. Produce spoils. People don't say that people spoil too when left in limbo long enough. My legs started to ache the way old scars ache in rain. I shifted weight from one heel to the other. The attendant's screen flashed a login timeout and she signed in again. She reached for a laminated guide that explained which code fit which incident and which incidents deserved a code at all. The first field asked for cause. She typed alarm at exit. The system spat it back and demanded a subcategory. The guard suggested electronics. I looked at the contents of my cart, then at the straps of my grandson's backpack. The word electronics floated between us like a mislabeled box. I asked that she enter alarm triggered, item unidentified, verification pending, and add no physical search requested or consented at this time. She hesitated, then nodded, then typed. The sound of each letter landing felt like the soft tap of a nail fixing something loose. A woman who had been behind us at register 3 drifted by and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says, "I remember you and I am pretending not to." I placed that nod in my own invisible ledger. My grandson wrote another line in his notes. He looked up at the clock again, 4:21. The minute hand moved as if embarrassed. I touched the corner of the receipt and pressed it flat, the way you iron a shirt cuff with your thumb when there's no time to fetch the iron. The attendant retrieved a thin binder from under the counter. Between plastic sheets, a copy of the exit verification policy lived in captive paragraphs. She slid it toward me, and I read it the way a man reads instructions for assembling something heavy. Equal treatment, minimal disruption, written record upon request. Supervisor presence recommended for disputes. I asked her to print a copy to attach to our incident. She said she would try. The printer coughed again, and the lights dimmed for a blink. Somewhere, a refrigeration unit switched on, and a cold ribbon of air wrapped my ankles. The guard shifted his weight, and for the first time looked not at us, but at the portal itself. A minute of thinking landed in his shoulders. He said the sensor can be sensitive to some dyes, to some tags that don't deactivate when they should. He said it the way a man tells himself a workable story. I nodded because reasons matter, even partial ones. I asked him to note his observation on the form. He cleared his throat and said the supervisor would take care of that. My grandson wrote, "Guard said sensor sensitive," and underlined it once. The attendant screen golden spun and then revealed a small victory. The form had accepted the incident number. She printed a temporary slip with spaces for signatures. The paper came out warm and smelling faintly of burned dust. She slid it across with a pen. I checked the text, date, time, location, summary. I asked her to add that we requested a review of camera footage for the specific path from produce to exit. Fruits, aisle 7, condiments, register 3. She added the line. That list steadied me. A map is a promise that ground exists beneath your feet. Behind us, the sliding doors sighed again, ushering in evening air and a fresh stack of customers. The alarm stayed quiet this time, which made the earlier scream feel more like a judgment than a tool. The guard relaxed a fraction and then immediately gathered himself back up. I rubbed the edge of the blue folder and remembered every clerical desk I had ever stood at, every window where a person with a badge and a screen decided whether my day would keep its shape.
A voice on the intercom asked for a spill cleanup in aisle 9, and I felt an odd kinship with that mess, something simple that still needed care. The supervisor did not appear, but his radio did. It crackled toward us, tethered to someone I could not see. The attendant spoke into it and received a soft approval to continue.
Approval looks like a gate swinging on a dry hinge. It moves, but it complains as it does. My grandson leaned a shoulder against me and whispered nothing, just placed his weight there for a second to show me we were still two people and not just two figures in a process. I answered by placing my hand on the cart and lifting it a half-inch to stop the squeak. Small things, controllable things. I asked, again, for the manager to confirm in writing that no item had been identified as unpaid. The attendant agreed to add a line once the supervisor signed off. She checked the clock. 4:24. Time had become a slow river, and we were standing in it up to our shins. A stock clerk rolled by with a crate of cans that clattered like distant hail. He pushed through the portal to the sales floor, and the alarm stayed quiet. The guard glanced at the doorway as if it had spoken out of turn. I asked if a test pass could be locked. He said tests were internal. I said internal things still leave marks on public time. The clerk kept going, wheels squealing, the smell of cardboard and tin trailing behind. The attendant returned a laminated policy to its sleeve and asked if we consented to a visual inspection of the cart. I said yes to the cart, no to the backpack, and yes to a scan of the receipt against the register's transaction log. She noted both. She ran the scanner over the barcodes, and they chirped the right way. Each beep a small alignment of claim and proof. The guard watched the motion with a careful stillness that made my neck stiff. The printer obeyed on the second try and spat out a copy of the policy with a faint band of gray across the middle, like a cloud laid on a sentence. I placed it under the receipt. The blue folder stood like a low wall between us and the tide of error. My grandson listed the documents we had collected so far and underlined the word receipt twice, then placed a dot after it with a firmness I admired. The attendant began to type the incident summary in full, fingers fluttering, and the sound of the keys was as soft rain on a metal roof. I lifted my eyes to the clock one more time and shaped a silent plan for the next step. Supervisor arrives, signature, camera review, written note, exit. I did not let my mind wander further. I have learned that hope must be measured so it doesn't tip the table. A door in the back swung open, and a manager hurried out, a stack of papers in one hand, a set of keys on his belt ringing lightly. He lifted his head toward us, then toward the guard, then toward the attendant's screen where our form blinked. He opened his mouth to speak, and the radio, clipped high on his shoulder, crackled with a message that changed the light behind his eyes. He raised one finger to the air as if to press pause on us all, and said he'd just been informed the camera system had hiccuped and likely missed the last few minutes around the exit. The word hiccup sounded small, too small for the gap it opened. I felt the floor tilt a degree under my shoes. Not enough to fall, enough to know the railing mattered. The manager scanned our faces like he was looking for a quick place to set the blame down and keep walking. I steadied myself with the same tools I always choose when the easy things slip away. Paper, sequence, witness. If the camera lost us, then we would rebuild the path out loud and on the page until it was solid enough for anyone to stand on.
I asked the manager to log the failure in the incident record by time and position, not as gossip, but as a fact. He nodded with the reflex of a man who knows what a record is for. I asked the attendant to add a line. Camera malfunction reported for minutes around 4:12 to 4:16, near exit. She typed, mouth tight. I slid the receipt closer and spoke our steps like a metronome. Produce section for peaches and greens, aisle 7 for condiments, water from the end cap by the freezer's hum. Register 3 where the belt studded and then smoothed out under our items, the blue folder, clipped closed, the exit, the alarm, the yellow tape, the waiting. My grandson held his phone like a lantern and scrolled through his notes. He had written times down to the minute and, when he could, to the half minute. He had a still photo of the clock on the wall, the minute hand like a nail head at 4:12. He had the receipts time-stamped and a shot of the register number sign hanging above the cashier like a street placard. He showed them to me as if placing stones into my palm. Each image cooled my blood a fraction, the way a cloth cools a fever. The manager listened and then paged someone from internal audit. He asked the guard to write the initial cause in the form. The guard hesitated over the field. Electronics no longer felt like a word that would survive a second look. He cleared his throat and wrote, "Exit alarm. Item not identified. Verification pending." I watched his pen move and felt a weird tenderness for the way ink can correct the course of an afternoon by millimeters. He added his initials, small and careful. The attendant printed the first page of the incident report and slid it to me for review. The paper came out with that faint heat and the dusty scent of a machine working a little too hard. The summary line was blunt and missing the one thing I needed it to say. I asked her to add that I requested immediate comparison of the receipt against the raw POS law for Register 3 and a check-in with the cashier who handled the transaction. She typed it in, each keystroke neat as a stitch. I asked her to include the phrase, "without prejudice to the customer's movement," because words like that keep the teeth of a process from closing too far. The audit staffer arrived, quiet shoes, clipboard, a small flashlight clipped to his belt as if problems hid in shadows. He introduced himself with an initial and a title, both forgettable on purpose. He said the cameras in the exit zone fed through a multiplexer, and sometimes frames dropped when the system tried to catch up. He said it like weather, like a thing you can describe but not fix with your hands. I repeated my request for auxiliary records, POS log for the time window, the censor's own event list if it had one, the cashier's statement, the book of occurrences if such a book existed. He nodded in a way that told me I had named the right doors to knock on. I pointed, gently, to the clock. 4:28. The numbers weren't dangerous. They were just time, and time was the one thing no one could say we hadn't given. People slid by, doing their grocery math, and the sound of carts against tile became a soft weather behind the counter. My back ached at the base where old work leaves its notch. I shifted, but I didn't sit. Sitting turns a person into furniture in rooms like this. Standing keeps you edges. The staffer pulled a printout of the POS log for the last 20 transactions at Register 3. The paper had dot matrix teeth on the sides and the smell of the stockroom on it, cardboard and toner, and something like cold metal. He traced down the times with a pen. There we were. Timestamps matched, items matched, total matched. He checked the code for the cashier number and wrote it in his notebook. I asked him to attach a copy to the incident file. He said he would, then glanced at the manager, and the manager nodded once, a permission stamped in the air.
My grandson brushed his shoulder against mine and then steadied the receipt with a fingertip so it wouldn't curl back on itself. That small gesture, the care of keeping proof flat, felt like a handrail on a narrow stair. I thought of the kitchen table, 2 stories waiting to be told later, and pushed that thought away because later isn't allowed here, only now is. I counted my breaths. I let the lemon cleaner and the yeast-sweet ghost of the bakery fight it out in the air. A woman drifted closer, the one I remembered from Register 3, the one who had watched us shift our carts so she could step forward. She didn't speak. She hovered in that fragile social space where a person wants to help but doesn't want to fall into the scene. She touched the edge of her own card and then the tip of her scarf, then looked at the attendant and made the small nod I recognized from a lifetime of living in other people's rooms. The attendant looked at me, then at the manager, and then wrote the word witness on a line that hadn't had a name yet. The audit staffer asked if he could retrace our route. He wanted to walk with us from produce to aisle 7 to register 3. I said I wouldn't move until the incident form acknowledged the camera failure and a request for written confirmation of our clearance when this ended. He looked surprised, then appreciative in the way people do when they realize they're not the only adult in the room. He wrote the additions himself and initialed them. We started to walk. The guard came along at a respectful distance, radio murmuring low. The cart's front wheel protested on every third rotation and then surrendered again. We moved through produce, where the mist systems had left beads on lettuce that looked like 1,000 tiny choices. We crossed to aisle 7. The condiments lived there in rows like little soldiers, labels forward, dates stamped with confidence. I pointed at the shelf where we had stood, at the gap our jar left. The audit staffer took a photo with a store device and logged the shelf tag number. Each click was a thread back through the maze. We rolled to the end cap where the water had hummed cold from the big cooler. I remembered the way the door stuck for a second and how my grandson had tugged it open with 2 hands. He nodded now, confirming the door's habit as if it were a friend you'd known long enough to expect the same joke. The staffer wrote, "Door sticks, observed." Not a complaint, just a note that helps a timeline wear shoes. We turned toward register 3. The cashier was there, the same woman, sleeves rolled up, scanning with a steady rhythm that told me she measured her day in beeps. The manager asked if she could confirm my transaction. She kept her eyes on the belt, then lifted them on a pause and said the number, the time, the fact that I had pressed the receipt flat against the clip before I left. I asked that her confirmation be written down with her code number, not her name. The staffer smiled a little at that and wrote it exactly as I asked. We reached the exit again and stopped at the yellow line as if it had been painted for us in particular. The alarm lay there in the air like a sleeping dog. I kept the blue folder on the cart handle where my fingers could find it without looking. The manager asked the guard to stand to one side while the staffer made a note about the portal's sensitivity. The attendant back at the counter typed in our route and the confirmations as if she were copying a recipe she would one day make for herself. A small tide of anger pressed against my ribs, then receded. Anger is a fast river. It takes you somewhere you didn't say you wanted to go. I turned that river into a list instead. I asked for the incident to be designated for training review. I asked for the phrase equal treatment to appear in it. I asked for the acknowledgement that no physical search had been consented to. The manager nodded with a face that said he preferred groceries to governance. He signaled to the attendant to include the phrases. She did, her fingers making the letters like stitches holding cloth. We stood another minute. People came and went. The store did what stores do. It sold things to people who met to eat and keep going. The audit staffer checked the sensor housing with the kind of respect you give a machine that has embarrassed you in public. He squinted at a sticker with a serial number. He wrote it down. He said something about recalibration that sounded like a prayer you say when the real tools are in a different building. I breathed through my nose and fixed my eyes on the route we had just walked, each point a peg in the ground. The blue folder's edge pressed a tiny dent into my palm, and that dent anchored me to myself in a place that would have liked me to float. My grandson stood close enough for our sleeves to share heat. He looked at the clock again. 4:34. He added the time to his notes with a slow hand that would read clearly later. The manager opened his mouth to suggest we move forward to the final step of verification when the sliding doors sighed open again and the alarm tore the air in two. If this resonates, leave a like, add your perspective below, and share it forward. The second alarm didn't point at us this time. It pointed at the doorway itself, the same mechanical howl, but with its finger aimed at nothing in particular. A stock clerk pushed through with a pallet of paper towels, eyes wide the way people's eyes go when a machine scolds them in public. The guard's shoulders loosened, then tightened again out of instinct. The manager took a breath that sounded like a reset. The audit staffer made a small note, then a bigger one, and the shape of the afternoon shifted by a few degrees. Not a rescue, a correction, taken its first step. I asked that the new alarm be entered alongside ours. Same minute, same portal, different subject. The attendant typed it in, and the form's white boxes began to look less like a trap and more like a ledger. The audit staffer crouched to inspect the sensor's base, the way a mechanic listens to an old engine with his ear. He ran a hand along the plastic seam and found nothing you can touch and fix, which is how these things usually go. He wrote the unit number and the word recalibration next to it. The pen's scratch on paper steadied me more than any apology would have. The manager signaled for a brief test sequence. He asked another employee to roll an empty cart through the portal. The alarm cried once, then not again, as if embarrassment had knocked something back into place. The guard watched the light on the tower blink without pattern. He shook his head, not in anger, but in that weary way of people who live near machinery that forgets its manners. The attendant added test pass inconsistent to our incident. I asked that inconsistent be defined with times and participants, and she obliged, line by line. I requested a written confirmation that our items matched the receipt and the POS log, that no unpaid product had been identified, and that any further steps would be for training only. The manager agreed, not with a flourish, but with the plainness of a man who wants the shelves stocked and the aisles quiet. He nodded to the attendant, and she prepared a letter on store letterhead. The printer warmed and sighed, leaving a faint chemical thread in the air. When the page slid out, the paper's heat against my fingertips felt like proof taking physical form. The guard initialed the section that described the approach as respectful and non-invasive, which mattered to me not because the words were sweet, but because someone would read them later and measure their truth. The audit staffer stapled the policy copy to the letter, then stapled our receipts duplicate to the back, so all the edges shared a spine. My blue folder waited on the counter like a flat lake, and I placed the packet inside, aligning corners until the stack behaved. My grandson recorded the incident number, the time, and the initials he could see. He stood a touch taller, not triumph, not even relief, just a posture that comes when a person's notes have found their places. If this resonates, leave a like, add your perspective below, and share it forward.
The woman from Register 3 drifted within polite distance and rested a hand on her basket. The attendant added her to the witness line without ceremony, just the code and the time she'd been nearby. The list looked right then. Receipt and log matched, camera gap acknowledged, portal misbehavior observed, witness noted, language about equal treatment present. The manager read the paragraph that promised a review of procedures at the exit and training refreshers for the team. He didn't move his lips on the words, but I could see him count the clauses like rungs on a short ladder. I asked the attendant to add one last sentence that would matter when memory blurs, that the customer requested written confirmation before departing, and that confirmation was given. She added it with careful strokes, then passed me a copy with my name and the time. The clock read 4:41 now, the minute hand a steady finger pointing to the right side of the day. The store soundtrack, which had faded under the weight of our focus, came back into the room like a background river. People resumed their ordinary faces. The fluorescent hum remembered it was supposed to be boring. We eased the cart forward a few feet, and the guard stepped aside. He no longer felt like a barrier. He felt like someone who had spent part of his shift in a place he didn't choose, walking along the narrow rail between caution and accusation. He gave me a nod that said he understood at least one thing better now than he had an hour ago. I returned it with the same small measure. These are the trades you can afford in public. Not absolution, not argument, but acknowledgement that the afternoon learned something it did not know. Before pushing the cart through the portal again, I checked the letter one more time for the phrases that carry weight. Incident designated for training review. Equal treatment. Written record provided upon request. No unpaid item identified. The words were all there, and they sat on the page without wobble. My grandson listed each phrase in his notes with small boxes beside them, then marked each box with a careful check. He looked at the portal, then at me. I answered by resting my palm on the cart handle, feeling the texture of the rubber grip, the tacky spot where 1,000 other hands had felt their own afternoon slow. We crossed the threshold without a sound. The alarm kept its peace. The doors exhaled us into the kind of late light that lies low over parking lots and turns every windshield into a quiet mirror. I felt air that did not belong to the store cool my cheeks. The weight that had pooled around my ankles climbed back up to the blue folder where paper could carry it. I stood beside the cart for a moment and let my knees recognize that standing can end. My grandson made a last note, then slid his phone into his pocket as if returning a tool to a drawer. At the trunk, the groceries found their places with the soft percussion of cloth against cardboard, bread against plastic. The smell of orange cleaner faded into the wider smell of warm asphalt and distant cut grass. A shopping cart wandered on a breeze, rattling softly until its wheel caught a paint stripe and settled. I sat on the edge of the seat for a breath before swinging my legs in. The blue folder lay across my lap, heavier than paper should be, which is how truth feels when it has to prove itself. On the drive home, neither of us tried to force a conversation across the silence. The road was smooth where it had been repaired this summer and rough where the budget had given out. Streetlights blinked awake with that first pale glow that is less light than promise. My hands listened to the steering wheel. My chest counted out the last tightness and let it go. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to make room for the next thing. My grandson rested his forehead against the window and followed the rhythm of passing trees. I recognized the posture from a dozen other after-school rides, but the set of his mouth told me he was measuring more than miles.
At home, the door's familiar weight in my palm reminded me that some thresholds are yours to command. The kitchen welcomed us with the faint sweetness of the bread we had bought, the green brightness of cilantro, the dry rattle of the paper bag on the counter. I set the blue folder down and opened it the way you open a book you intend to teach from. I laid the letter and the policy on the table, placed the receipt between them like a narrow bridge. The table's wood was warm from the day. The light above it hummed in a lower key than the store's, a domestic tone that lets a person breathe differently. I filled a pot and placed it on the burner. The flame caught and made that soft sound that belongs to gas in evenings.
The ritual of rinsing greens and tearing bread steadied my hands better than any chair would have. In the other room, a distant clock apologized for being a minute behind. My grandson washed apples and lined them along the counter as if arranging proof that color existed outside fluorescent bulbs. The simple order of the kitchen gave back shape to all the minutes that had blurred. I thought of the two stories I wanted to tell at this table, not as weapons or trophies, but as maps that help a person understand where their feet are. The blue folder, with its stack of small victories and precise words, was one kind of map. The other kind would require the quiet that follows dinner, the steady pace of a voice that has time. I set 2 bowls on the table and 2 spoons, a small ceremony for ordinary hunger, and felt the room widen enough to hold us both. Then I sat, touched the receipt one more time to press it flat, and let the calm arrive without fanfare. Morning came soft and clear, the kind of light that lays a gentle hand on a table and invites you to use it well. I set the blue folder beside the bowls, not as a trophy, but as a compass. Steam lifted from the pot, carrying the smell of greens and broth, the language of simple food. My grandson sat across from me with the careful posture of someone waiting to see which way the day would lean. I breathed in, laid my palm on the folder, and began the work I had promised myself, to build sense where insult had tried to carve a hollow. I told him 2 stories in the quiet way that keeps echoes kind. I laid them side by side like maps unrolled on wood. In one, people rooted to a land before a flag knew its own colors, carrying memory as anchor and proof. In the other, people who arrived after, pulled by storms and pushing against walls, laying down tracks and habits, sometimes breaking, sometimes repairing. I named shadows and routes, losses and gifts, the stubbornness of hurt and the stubbornness of making. I did not stack the stories like a ladder to crown one above the other. I lined them like a road with 2 lanes, marked for careful passing. He listened, hands around the warm bowl, face quiet except for the little changes that show thinking is happening. When I finished, he nodded once. He did not make a speech. He got up and washed the bowls as if washing could clear the fog off a morning window. At school, the day still held the frayed edge of the parade. Posters from yesterday's decorations leaned tired against a wall. The chatter had the brittle quality of a room split between a celebration and a complaint. My grandson asked for the floor with a voice that didn't ask for applause. He held a spiral notebook against his chest and said he wanted to work, not win. He proposed that the class gather family stories, photographs, and documents, set them in order by time and place, and build a shared mural in the hallway where everyone walked without thinking. He said the mural should offer both lanes of the road and invite careful passing. He said a policy in a store meant little unless it was written where people could see it, and that memory works the same way. The teacher watched him with the face of someone weighing more than a permission slip. A few students shifted in their chairs as if a new weather front had moved across their skin. A boy who had laughed too quickly the day before raised his hand and let it fall again, the motion honest enough to count. A girl who had argued for one holiday over the other chewed her lip and then nodded in a small circle like a gear finding its tooth. The teacher opened a binder and pulled out a fresh page. She wrote project proposal at the top, then asked for volunteers. Hands rose that hadn't been near the air yesterday. The room's sound changed by a half step. Work has its own music. They drew lines on the board. Interviews, scanning, captioning, sourcing. My grandson wrote his name next to recording procedures and documenting timelines. He carried his notes from the store into the task. Who, what, when, where, how recorded, how kept. I watched from the back like a man at a glass door, seeing his own breath mark the pane and deciding to let it be part of the view. The plan formed in public, and because it formed in public, it belonged to more than one person. That is how change forgets to be a fight. In the afternoon, I returned to the market, not to relive an hour, but to finish a grocery list. The parking lot was the same. Oil rainbows at the edge of puddles. Carts nose to tail in their corral. Inside, the air held a fresher note, as if the night crew had cracked more windows than usual. The portal stood where it always stands, a pair of gray shoulders framing the room. On the wall beside it, a clear sleeve held a printed notice on store letterhead. The paper had that new paper smell, crisp and slightly sweet from the printer's heat. The notice read that exit verification procedures had been reviewed, that approach would be consistent and minimally disruptive, that written records would be provided upon request, and that staff training had been scheduled for the following week. It wasn't poetry. It was a sign you could point to without raising your voice. Near customer service, the manager gathered the guard and a few employees in a small huddle. No grandstanding, no applause. He spoke low and posted a schedule. The audit staffer, sleeves rolled, demonstrated how to log an incident with exact times and neutral language. They nodded, some stiffly, some with the relief of having steps to walk. The guard glanced over and saw me and gave a short nod that said he recognized me, not as an accident, but as a person. I returned it. We had both endured the same hour differently, and now we were both subject to a line of text that might make the next hour kinder. I didn't linger. I bought what I came for and left with the gentle hiss of the doors, deciding I was nobody's problem. On the sidewalk, a mother adjusted a child's backpack and the little zipper charm clicked like a tiny bell. I stood for a second in that ordinary sound and felt the way a day that could have sunk us had, instead, placed a plank for us to walk across. 2 days later, I walked the school hallway slowly, past lockers dented in familiar places, past flyers for clubs, past the machine that sells pencils 1 coin at a time. The mural had begun. It ran down the wall in a growing braid of images and text blocks. Old photos of grandmothers in dresses worn shiny at the elbows. A copy of a land survey annotated in the corner by a great-uncle's hand. A newspaper clipping about a march. A church program folded and taped flat. A page from a family Bible. A bus ticket. A small map. A caption in a child's handwriting that said, "My aunt keeps corn seeds in a jar and says they are older than she is." My grandson had drawn a timeline taped down the center with painter's tape and labeled decades like towns along a route. Students stood in pairs and trios, reading, pointing, writing. Arguments had softened into tasks. Who will scan this? Who will call that? Who will check the date on this corner with the county clerk?
The principal approached and stood with me for a time without saying anything. We watched the white space shrink. We watched a girl stand on tiptoe to place a photo square enough to match another across from it, a neat symmetry of different branches reaching toward the same length. My grandson moved with a clipboard, asking a question here, writing a name there, reminding someone to note where an object would go back when the display ended. He had learned the quiet authority of keeping track. Back at my kitchen table, the blue folder lay open with the store's letter, the copy of the policy, the receipt pressed flat between them like a leaf you saved to prove a season happened. I realized the folder no longer felt heavy. It felt right-sized for a life that had room for both records and meals. I understood then that the point had never been to beat a person with a badge or to win a hallway. The point was to get the lines written where anyone could see them, then to teach a child to read those lines and write his own in that same public ink. When evening came, I returned to the market for one last errand and saw the guard speaking to an older couple by the portal, with his palms open at his waist, voice calm, his body arranged to be smaller than their worry. He gestured to the notice on the wall and handed them a printed copy without being asked.
The couple read and nodded and passed through without a siren. The guard exhaled. He did not change the world in that moment. He changed his part in it. Sometimes that is all a shift can hold. On my way out, a cashier I recognized from Register 3 met my eye and gave a wave that was not a greeting so much as an acknowledgement that the place had learned something. Not a lot, not enough. Enough to be written down. I stepped into the late light and breathed air that had no policy attached. A day can be dragged into anger or set on rails for meaning. Hours rolled, slow and clicking, into the station we chose. We left a paper trail the way hikers leave stones, so those who come next can trust the path. By respect, unity, and contribution, crooked pasts can still carry a straight future. If you stayed to the end, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me what you do, especially if it were your family. Until next time.